Hello and welcome to the Emergency Services Times podcast, where you can hear the speakers who joined us on stage at the Emergency Services Show 2024. Evaluating PPE takes time and costs money, so let's do it once for the benefit of all. Can a small representative group adequately reflect the experience of the whole workforce? And at what cost to suppliers and ultimately the fire service? In this session, hear the discussion as the panel discuss what is the right approach.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name's Chris Colgan. I'm ex-fire officer in Kent Fire and Rescue Service. Did 32 years. During that time, I was the national lead for PPE, and the former Steve Topham, chair of the PPE committee. And he's never forgiven me for passing him the baton since I retired. And I'm now working as an independent consultant and working predominantly with Simon Hunter and Hunter Apparel Solutions.
Excellent, thanks Chris. Roddy?
Yep, thanks everybody. I'm Roddy MacKinnon. I'm the National Equipment and Logistics Manager with the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and I've got the remit for the procurement and introduction of all our PPE within the service.
Fantastic, thanks Roddy. And it seems like we're going to have to contend with them dismantling the show around us at the back here. So if you can't hear, perhaps we can raise the volume with the AV technicians. Yeah, lovely. And speak up. Thanks. Last but by no means least, Nat.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Nat Wilson. I'm MD and founder of Workwear Solutions International. So it's a consultancy business. I've spent 18 plus years working on the supplier side of industry, and now poacher term gamekeeper, work primarily with end users, helping them specify products and go through their tender processes when they're procuring.
Excellent. So the topic of the conversation is about the wearer evaluations as part of a procurement process, and what the benefits are of that. But firstly, from a supplier's perspective, Chris, what's the actual cost associated with taking part in a two things: the procurement process in its entirety, and then the wearer evaluations as a singular element?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to actually put a cost on these things, but I think it's not insignificant amount of money, and but suppliers will do that if they're really keen on winning the business, and there's probably a feeling of compulsion on the part of suppliers that feels they need to jump through the hoops and supply kit. You could break it down to a unit cost if you're talking about an ensemble of PPE, but what I would say is that unit cost is probably more expensive than an off-the-peg ensemble, because it's a special manufacture. So you're probably looking at upwards of £2,500 on average for an ensemble. So if you then extrapolate that out and you say, well, how many wearer trials how many trialists are we going to have? We're going to have 30 trialists. I know in the last collaboration we started out with a very high number, and we managed to whittle it down to something more reasonable. But even then, you could be looking at expenditure of £60,000 if you've got 30 trialists, which is not an insignificant amount of money. Because they're taken as special measures. And it's not just the manufacture of the items; it's also the transport, getting them there, 5 washes, so laundering them beforehand, collecting them, returning them. So it's not an insignificant amount of money that we expect suppliers to outlay. And then I think what you have to bear in mind is the impact that has, because a smaller medium enterprise might be deterred from bidding for that work, which is not in the interest of the sector, because they're thinking, well, I'd love to bid, but on the chances of, what's our probability of winning? If we don't win, that money's sunk, it's lost. And then on top of that, even the winning bidder may look to recoup some of those costs in the bottom line. So I think, to answer your question, for trials alone, it's quite expensive. Could be up to 30,000, 60,000, depending on how many trialists you've got, and that comes at a cost to the sector as well. because I don't think you get quite as many people apply for the tender, and the winning bidder will probably look to recoup some of that money across the life of the contract. In terms of the wider procurement process, again, you could be doubling that figure. So, like I say, it is really reducing the options of those that are going to apply for that tender, and suppliers are having to make difficult choices and pick which tenders they feel they've got a reasonable chance of winning to justify that outlay. And I think that's something that the sector needs to be cognizant of.
Yeah, thanks. Not insignificant amounts of money, and as you say, sometimes that can't be recouped, and could be the reason that people don't apply, and that's not a good, healthy position.
Yeah.
So Roddy, what's the importance to the sector, to the fire service, of undertaking these wearer evaluations?
It can be very difficult, Brett, obviously, but when you're looking at it as an end user, you're looking to have that hearts and minds buy-in from the end user. We can sit as a technical group and look at the performance and the data that's provided through your specifications, through your testing, through your certifications, but you still have an end user at the end of the day that has to have that confidence that the PPE that you're putting into service is going to perform to the specifications. It's going to give them the comfort, the wearability, the breathability, and actually have that end buy-in. Having the involvement of an end user without doing practical trials is very difficult, because you will be constantly fighting against firefighters who say, we have not trialled this, it has not been on the back of a firefighter, so how can you tell me that it is going to be a fit-for-purpose garment that's going to protect me in the operational activities that I'm expected to carry out? It comes with challenges, because any user trial will come back to subjectivity from that end wearer, and each wearer will have a different option and a different feedback, and that's the difficult bit in trying to manage that. And especially when we look at the scale of the NFCC collaborative framework, when you have a small number of wearers that's coming in that is making a decision for a service, and I'll speak about Scotland, for 6,500 firefighters, that I may end up with 3 end users doing the trial. They are ultimately making the decision for that service. But at least we can then go back with confidence, say we have been involved, we have had that engagement, and we have the wearers with this PPE, and the feedback is there to show that it's performing exactly where we're looking to perform in.
Yeah, no, interesting. I mean, it's certainly about hearts and minds. I really do understand that. Having been an end user myself, you would expect the kit to have been tested and trialled in some way, shape or form. But it does come back to that question around subjectivity of the individuals being used, and can they speak for the wider audience. So, you've got experience of wearer evaluations. What do you see as the role that they play in procurement processes?
I think they're really important for both sides, actually. I think if they're managed properly, if you build them in a way to the tender process that makes it kind of attractive for suppliers, then you can really get some good data out of it. We talked this morning in the ergonomics discussion around, we can do all of the lab testing, we can do mannequin testing in climatic environments, but until you put it on a person, you don't really understand the comfort part of it, or you don't understand the practicality of have they put that pocket in exactly the right place, or that kind of thing. So we've just done a big project with the European military client, and we're sort of still in tender process, so I can talk about a fair amount of it. But it was a really interesting I think it's a really good example of, and I would say that I'm involved, I'm biased, but it's a really good example of how to manage this in a way that works for the supplier and for the buyer, I think. So when one of the things that around the cost of sampling is when you have a one-stage process, everyone has to submit samples, even if you might be eliminating them on a certain point. So I would never ever say that that's the ideal way forward. You always want to have at least a two-stage process. The process that we've gone through is a negotiated procedure, so it's a little bit more complicated, 4 stages. first stage was PQQ, we went from 7 to 4. Second stage was ITT stage 1, and that was eliminated down from 4 to 2. And what happened in that stage was we gave 5 individual wearers body measurements to the tenderers for them to provide the system. So it's a bit different because it's a military system, it's a system from the skin out. And they then had to provide just 5 sets of kit. And we did some initial fit testing. So the first one was, is this supplier able to provide this range of people with kit that fits them? Based on what they've had as measurements. And the second thing was, they've said this is an ensemble, so how does it all work together? And we did some really basic fit testing and movement testing based on the different systems. So we literally spent a day with each individual person. We made sure that they were separated so they couldn't give each other their feedback about what they thought about it. And then that allowed us we did some static movements, so kind of stood, moving your arms around, bending. Then we did some more dynamic movements where they were lifting, they were jogging on the spot, lunging and kicking, things like that. And that gave us some data that we were then able to use to help with the decision-making process about the next stage, but also then to enter into stage 3, which was the negotiation stage. And we were able to say, this particular, I'll just give a daft example, but this hat doesn't fit. So you need to look at how that hat, they don't have a hat in their system, which is why I'm using that. This hat, you might need to consider it because it didn't fit everybody, or this was an item that you might want to address. Then that gives the supplier, so nobody's invested more than 5 sets of kit. We've done some testing on it. Anyone who was eliminated got really detailed feedback about why they're eliminated, so there's some value in that because they can use that for developing other projects going forwards. And then the people who were in the next stage got some feedback to give them a better chance of getting the kit right. And then the final stages, and we've done lots of testing of materials and everything as well. The final stage is then wearer trial. There's a 40-person wearer trial happening. They're going to be conducting tests like normal operational activities over a 2-week period. We're capturing data after every single activity that they do, so that could be up to 20 different sets. We're managing it so that I would get both sets of kit for the 2 tenderers, and I do the same activities, and then the next day I swap over and do different. We split the team into 2, so Team A do it on day 1 and Team A do the next one on day 2, and we kind of managed it like that. So we're trying to even the playing field in terms of what that feedback is and how it comes. And then we're also doing mannequin testing for movement and also climatic chamber testing as well. So it's a really, really robust process. There is some cost to the buyer, and to the supplier, of course. But the idea is we're trying to get as much data as possible from as many different ways that we can in the process.
Yeah. Okay. So couple of questions from me that lead on from that. So firstly, can 5 and/or 40 be representative of a much larger workforce?
They can if you choose them properly. So the 5 people who were chosen were from a private to a colonel, and they have 7% female workforce, but we had 2 females and 3 males. All were specifically selected because they were different body types and they were different ages, so they went from their mid-20s to their mid-50s. We had a diverse amount of information that we're then taking to the next stage. And the 40, again, it's a big number to conduct wearer trials with, and it's quite complex in that. And but if you can choose a group that are as representative as possible of the wider community, so if you, for example, were doing it on a national level in the collaborative hub, you need to be picking people from different regions so it doesn't become like the Kent project or the Manchester project or wherever. It has to be seen as being really to people taken from across the country.
But I think that's where the sector needs to mature a little, because we had exactly that issue in the last collaborative where everybody wanted to put at least one wearer forward. And then when you aggregated all of the numbers, you're looking at huge numbers, huge costs, and it was unreasonable, unfair on suppliers. And if you've got one person, have they got the universal support of all of their peers to talk on their behalf? So I think if the sector, and we see this outside of PPE as well, in terms of a new innovation, a fire service thinks, actually, we like the look of that. We want to conduct our own trials. They're not, I don't think, looking back on the sector, we're very good at learning from partners and actually taking those results and saying, well, if you've actually trialled it, give us your results, and actually we do the same job and we respect what feedback you got and what you use forward. And I think that would help the process. So I'm not against wearer trials. I just think they need refining and understanding that they come with risk. And the biggest risk I think that they come with is, I get the bit, like Roddy says, about engagement, and it's really important to be able to say to your firefighters, you have a say. But I think you have to be very careful and very clear about how much skin in the game they've got as a trialist. Because if you suggest to these trialists that they're going to be picking the kit, and that's not the case, if that's not the case, which I doubt it would be, then the difficulty that arises is people in good faith trial the kit, they have a preferred chosen kit, they say we all like this kit universally, this was the best one for comfort, for allowing us to do our job. Then when that goes into the algorithm and the machinery of working out which one wins the tender and cost then plays its part, so you've gone from a position where you've really shown that you're listening to your workforce, they feel that they're being listened to, they feel like they've got an opportunity to influence what they get. When they don't see the one that they chose come through the process, that chosen supplier's got an uphill struggle because they're saying, you went for the cheapest one or you went for the cheaper one. And so what started out as an incentive turns into a real negative impact on your morale and on people's perception of the kit that they've now got to use. And I think that's a real danger. So the answer is not to say don't do wearer trials, it's just to be very clear what part they are playing in the process. And I think the starting point for that has got to be, what is it you're trying to evaluate and how are you going to evaluate it? What does good look like? And I think that's where the difficulty comes in terms of the subjectivity that we spoke about, and how are you going to measure that? Because I was listening to one of the earlier seminars today, and I can't remember who it was, but someone said, I'll ask the audience, how do you measure, what's comfort? Yeah, how do you define comfort? And every individual will have a different perception of what comfort is. And that just, so I'm not against wearer trials, I just think they need refining. We need to understand how we're going to evaluate, and the trialists need to understand how far they will influence the process, because otherwise it will turn into a disincentive.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to come back on that point. I just wanted to pick one more point up with Nat. So you said 40 wearers. How big is the total workforce?
9,000.
9,000?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's markedly different from the collaboration where we trialled 30 sets of uniform, but probably ended up with somewhere in excess of 20,000 wearers. So, you know, the scale difference there is quite marked. But of course, the more trialists, the more cost, etc.
Yeah, I think it's also, as Chris is saying, it depends on how you're using that information. So I think the worst thing you can do is say we're going to do a trial and we pick A or B, and it's that basic, and that's not going to work that doesn't give you a real answer, and it doesn't give them confidence that they've actually contributed to something. I think the way that we tried to do it was to get lots of, we basically gathered, like, on a very basic level, when you're doing this activity in this type of product, how easy is it for you to move, and how comfortable do you feel in it? Is there any part of that system restricting your movement when you do any of these things? And they all had to give us a score out of 10. Anyone who scored lower than a 7 had to explain why it was causing them something different. So it's not just, oh yeah, I don't like that, whatever, you know, it's a bit crap, we'll give it a 3. They had to give us a real answer for it. And then if you've got enough of that data, you've got lots of numbers, and then that gives you an output of, right, well, this system scored 78% with this wearer, for example. I think the other thing that you should think about is how it's built into the tender, because it is a big cost to the suppliers, and it's a really important part of the process. What are you doing with it? Is it allocated points? Are is it part of the marking system? Are you just doing it as a tick box to say if one of them is a disaster, you don't go forward? Like, how do you use that as a contracting authority so that it does become meaningful information and a meaningful process?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because I think my experiences over a number of national frameworks is that the outcome of the wearer evaluations has had little impact on the overall result. And that's the point of then questioning when you look back on things and say, well, what is the actual worth of that, other than the hearts and minds? And I get that, and perhaps that needs to be addressed in another way.
Exactly.
By involving them in the whole process, and explaining that in an educational way right through the process to the end result. I guess, and a question to you, Chris, I guess before you would put anything in front of a tenderer or for a tender opportunity, you would have designed some kit and you would have done some evaluations of the performance of that. You would have spoken to the end users in different contexts, whether it's an event like this and they come to your stand and do those sorts of things. So you've already probably done quite a lot of research and development before you actually put something in front of the procurement team to assess. So in effect, wearer evaluations have happened in the development of that kit.
Yeah, definitely so. I suppose if it's a completely new concept that you're introducing, then there may not be so much evidence for that particular garment. But as you quite rightly point out, Brett, quite often it will be an iteration of a product, and you've got the best wearer trials going, because if it's out in service and it's being used, there's opportunities there to use that feedback in a real life scenario rather than a fabricated evaluation process. So I think there is a lot more that could be done in terms of asking suppliers to provide evidence in another way. And in that way you can triangulate. So if you do still continue to do the traditional wearer trials, along the lines, I support along the lines of that Natalie was saying, very focused, it's got a real outcome-based element to it, where you're really clear on what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to evaluate it. Well, perhaps a scaled-down version of that, triangulated with other evidence provided, testimonies and the like. It goes back to my point. I don't think the sector's very good at taking testimonies from neighbouring services. There's this hang-up, around this show. Whatever people are looking to buy, another service has probably already bought it, but they want to do their own trials. And I think that's a traditional cultural thing. And I think there needs to be I think the PPE committee is a good place to start, and we try to break down those barriers, and the cross-regional work that you do, actually, I think is probably opening up people's minds to being more receptive to taking data and evidence from colleagues in other services rather than doing their own thing again and again.
Can I be slightly devil's advocate to that?
Absolutely.
I agree, there's lots of work that's already done. A part of the process for the contract that I was talking about, they put a very heavy weighting on references. So from other militaries across Europe who were using similar systems, and they created 3 different reference types, and you got a certain number of scores depending on which reference type you could adjust to. So someone also supplying the total system that they were looking for scored the highest. If they provided parts of that system, they were next, and so on. So it's a really interesting way, but use it as part of the evaluation system. What happened then was that there were 4 systems that were shortlisted, all of whom in use somewhere in Europe or in the world. And one of them that's the most extensively used, I guess, across, there were 4 different countries that take that particular system. That one absolutely failed on wearer testing. They absolutely hated it, and particularly the females hated it. It was a unisex system, had fixed knee protection that wasn't in the right place. It would have been a cheapest option because they provided less items within the layers, but the system needed more layers within it. It was the right thing for that system to be eliminated, and if we hadn't placed the value on the process that we did and just kind of said, well, that's been tested so we can put that kind of through, we would have ended up potentially with a system being trialled extensively that actually failed on a number of levels for comfort, for example, before it even got to that stage.
But I'm assuming in that scenario that feedback was out there. Did you approach the services that are using it and saying, don't buy this because of these reasons?
Yeah, and they're a different. They didn't find the same problems. They didn't report any of the same issues that we were finding. One of the systems. So trying to say this without being too explicit about who it is. So there are 4 nations. One of the nations hasn't yet received it and is really looking forward to going into it because it's better than what they've got now. So even if it's not perfect, it's better than what they've got now. And so that's a real kind of thin line for them. And one of the first ones that have gone into it have said they want Mark II, and the contract's still got another 3 years to run on it, and they're looking to change pieces.
But does that not suggest there's a disconnect between the fabricated wearer trial and real life scenario if your results didn't match real life experience? Just playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask this question to Roddy because I know that he's been through this experience before. So moving from your pre-existing provision into a new provision, how good or bad that is, there are problems in that, aren't there?
There's always problems when you change, and it's that change that nobody likes within a service. They become very comfortable and settled with, whether it's PPE or equipment or no matter what they're using. When you then try and change that, and the cultural change that comes with it as well, when you may be coming away from a unisex type approach going into specific variants and trying to implement that on a staged approach is very difficult as well. You will always get the negative feedback coming back, and I think it picks up, Chris, what you were saying, where an end user or a trialist comes back from being involved in those trials and they have an interpretation of what was the best outcome, and it turns out that it's not that outcome, and the negativity that then transfers right through the service, and it comes back to, you've bought a cheap option, you've went for something that doesn't meet our needs, and it's trying to keep the positivity and show the benefits that are coming out of it. And as long as we can evidence that we have done our due diligence as part of the overall procurement process, from a technical element, looking at the specifications, looking at the technical performance, looking at the certification, as well as using the user trials. And we do need to get better at the user trials to actually show that they are a benefit, but they're meaningful, and we actually provide something at the end of it to show that the end user has had an input into it. It's the biggest area that you'll find that a legal challenge can come in from a procurement process is your weather trials. It's the biggest area that you can find because of the subjectivity, because of the differences, and that's where you'll get your legal challenge. But when you're bringing something new into the service, getting that end user, getting it in there and allowing them to have a voice at the end of it or even through the process. So when we introduced it into Scotland with the collaborative framework, we then started doing staff surveys on a 6-monthly basis, sending it out to the stations, allowing them to feedback and allowing them to give the positives as well as the negatives. But that allowed us to then come back through the collaborative framework, through a supply chain, to try and address some of the issues that are getting picked up when it becomes an operational piece of kit. And it was a benefit to us, and the crews appreciated that because they then seen that you were listening to what they were telling you, you were then trying to take actions against it, and you were then being able to change whether it was a product, whether it was the specification or the design of it. But they then got that positivity that their voice is being heard across the service.
Yeah, and there's definitely a piece there around education right through the process, but post-process as well to try and eke those improvements if there are issues raised. You also raised another interesting point around, the the potential restrictions within a procurement process and what we need to be careful of when we're evaluating products. So we can't just have free rein to evaluate them in any particular way, can we? What type of restrictions are we bound by?
Legally, you're bound by the legal aspects of it, first of all, and making sure that when you are undertaking your performance and your specifications, that you are not limiting the marketplace, that you are leaving it open, you're leaving it transparent, that you are not identifying a single product or a single manufacturer that can provide you that. And I think that's the difficulty. We can all sit and say we think we know what the best item or the best garment or the best performing supplier is, but we then need to make sure that we are leaving that open to the full marketplace and that we are not being restrictive within that process. We've been there, we've been challenged, we've been through that kind of area, and I don't think it's anything that anybody wants to go through when you start then having to deal with that legal challenge element, because you are doing the right thing, or you think you're doing the right thing, and you're trying to provide the best performing PPE that you know is available in the marketplace to protect your firefighters, but it then restricts you in the marketplace, and you're then open to that challenge from the supply chain.
Yeah, and specifically around the wearer evaluation element of it, can we just put the kit out on station and let them get on with it for 2 weeks? Is that a good way of evaluating kit?
No. No.
Why not?
It comes back to it needs to be done within a controlled environment. You need to be undertaking your evaluations in the same process, in the same manner, and retrospectively replicating that across the board. As I said, that the legal challenge is where you'll get that coming back if you do not undertake your wearer trials in the same way, retrospectively making sure that everybody is being treated equally with the same trial in the same environment and the same conditions, so that you have that equal opportunities and there is no risk to anybody coming back and challenge that you've did something different and they've then suffered because the weather conditions have been different, the environment's been different, the trial has been different. So you need to keep that respective, easy way of doing it.
And that's exactly what you built into your process by the sound of it.
Yeah.
A very stringent, follow these guidelines in all cases.
Yeah, and I think the thing, having been on the supplier side for such a long time, one of the most frustrating things is that you spend months and months and loads of money trying to bid for tenders, and then you just get, oh no, you didn't win, you scored 7. Like, there's no real feedback, and it's one of the things that I've been really pushing that we do with my clients, and we're giving much better feedback to suppliers. So you'll find you get less challenge if you give more feedback, because the problem is if you just see this gap and you don't understand what was in that gap to get to that score, you're going to challenge it because you want to know. You want to know either to say, actually, we think you were wrong, or we want to know so that you can say, yeah, okay, great, we can learn from that now and we can develop it. And it's about making that part of the process for the supplier valuable as well, and giving as much detail as possible. The other thing that we see, and again, I'm trying not to be too biased about it, but when you are asking for samples, and I'm going to say less structural firefighting PPE and more, let's just take station wear, for example. When you're doing a technical assessment on that garment, what does that look like? What does it mean? Who in the organisation is qualified to do it in the same way as whatever part you're looking at? And if you've got people who know what they're looking at and can give you feedback that you can give as part of outcome letters, that's a massive bonus in terms of how that communication works, and being really transparent from the outset as to what the intentions are of the process, how it's going to be assessed. All of that stuff will already have been agreed internally. If you share that with industry and you follow it, you're creating less opportunity for conflict and for challenge at the end of that process anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
Hiya, this question is for Nat. I'm Yassi, I'm the head of category for LFB, London Fire Brigade. My question is, when you did the trials for, I think it's a 30, and you had a mandatory section where you asked, they had to explain why they scored less than 7. In terms of collating those, how did you make sure it was mandatory? What were the challenges and the timescales around making sure you got those feedback?
Yeah, so we did it for the 5. The 40 trial hasn't happened yet. We're in the process, but we've got a process for that. This one's finished. So we had 5 trialists. We had 1 a day, and we spent up to 8 hours with them. They tried on the kit. We created the documentation where we were capturing the information and the feedback from them, and it was very clearly laid out in the tender process. If any of the garments within a layer didn't fit, they had like 1 garment didn't fit, you just scored 2 instead of 3. If 2 or more didn't fit, you scored 0. So we're very clear about how that was going to happen, and we also defined what doesn't fit looked like. So we said it had to be something that would have caused a problem if they were working, so the sleeves were too long or they couldn't do it up, just for example. And then on the second stage we had each of the tenderers, as part of their process, we'd set some NATO sort of specified environments that they were working within. And we said, if I was in this environment, what's the ensemble that I need to be wearing? So they gave us that information, and then we literally categorised each of those, and we had the 8 different activity levels, and they were all scored out of 10, and then that gave us the final result. But what we also did was to make sure it was as fair as possible. As I said, they didn't know who the other trialists were, they didn't speak to each other. We did it in a controlled environment, so it was myself and a colleague and 1 person from the client. None of us were allowed to give our opinions, and I had to tell my client to stop asking very weighted questions at one point. So yeah, just making sure that it was as close as we could for that. What we also did was change the order that they tried on the garments, because what we didn't want was like trial fatigue to hit in. So if you did tender a 4 the last time of the day, every day, everyone's going to be like, yeah, it's fine, or and by then they know if they score less than 7, they've got to give me some more information. So they're like, no, it's an 8, like, so that they don't have to do anything. So we really kind of mixed it up. It was quite a complex process.
But I guess one of the important elements there is to capture that data immediately after the event.
Yeah, it was during the event we were capturing the data. Yeah.
Hi, I'm John Ray from FlamePro. I have a background in hazmat gas-tight suits. They actually have a practical performance test within that standard that is done by firefighters as part of the certification. It involves climbing ladders, undoing valves, working in a cold environment. It takes no more than about 40 minutes. They're wearing breathing apparatus. So it's something you could consider in having a standardised format that could be used in each service.
There's an ISO standard, I can't remember if it's in development or not, that's looking at how to conduct wearer trials as well, how to get people to do evaluations. So we identified some of the suggested movements. We identified some of those so that we did a good number but covered the whole of the body and the whole of range of movement. So you're right, you can do that too.
Sorry, Chris, before you answer that. Sorry. So that's British Standard 8469, which has now been replaced by a new European standard on ergonomics, and that existing British standard, which was specific for firefighters, will now be withdrawn as part of that process. So you need to look out for the new standard in that respect. And just picking up on the standards piece of work, there are some standards that, as part of the performance requirements to achieve the standard, to get your CE mark to put it onto the market, do require some wearer evaluations to be taken into consideration. So that's something for, a good example. So it's incumbent on the standards makers as well to try to assist in this process as well. Sorry, Chris, you had a point.
That's fine. I was just going to add to Nat's point and say that actually what would be useful is commitment from the sector side, and then that is actually to train your trialists, give them some input, because I think we select them, we put them through, and then we're trying to coach them not to do bad practice during the actual process. It would show a good commitment and value to the cause if they, it's just like any interview process, a license to recruit, you can have a license to trial. And I think something like that would show suppliers that there's commitment on both sides. Because the straw poll question would have to be, if the sector had to fund these trials, would they be so keen to do them in the numbers that they do them? And I think the answers might come out slightly different then, because the value of what you get from it, in terms of coming out of our expenditure, it's biased in the weighting at the moment. It's it's good market engagement, it's good for morale and all of these things, and it's not costing us anything in terms of monetary value. It is in time and effort. So I think, ask those questions of yourselves and then think, would I still be so keen to do them in their current format?
I think that's a very good point, because I think if money was no object, we could purchase all the kit, put it through our processes over a period of time, and then make a selection at the end of it through a process. But quite clearly we don't have the funding to be able to do that, so we're sort of offsetting that onto yourselves, and we could help develop a number of companies' products right up to a point where everybody's happy with everybody's piece of kit, and that would be, I guess, the ideal world. But of course we don't live in that ideal world. We don't have that sort of money and or time to undertake that research and development.
It's a very expensive way of getting employee engagement, and what I would challenge and say is, are there opportunities to engage with the workforce before that stage, so that they actually feel part of the co-designing of the specification? So I know we've got the committee and the regions all represented, but if there was opportunities to engage the workforce in actually designing the specification, that is a form of engagement across the workforce, but not at the selection stage. And actually that might manage their expectations better, and they leave the selection bit to the people that are trained and professional, and there's an element of trust there.
Tony Arnott from FlamePro. Just a question on evaluations. It's often used to make a decision on the purchasing, but how can we build into tender awards technical refreshes, so that innovation and the innovation keeps going, not just at a buying decision, but through the whole life of a contract, so that firefighters are given the best protection that is available? Because we all know in the life of a contract there are more innovations, more developments. How can we build that into a contract so that the innovation keeps flowing?
So you have to be really careful about what you can allow to be redeveloped through the tender process, because you can't look like you've gone out for tender for one thing and then you change to something different. That would cause massive challenge. What you, I guess you can do, and one thing that we've done, again with the same client but on their ceremonial uniforms, is to say that this is their current fabrics that they've got. There is a requirement throughout the throughout the contract, to update the fabrics that are being used within that process. And to be fair, they're using us as their technical consultants to be able to go, hang on a minute, if you put that new fabric in, that's not an extra £200 a garment, like that's not reasonable. And so they're using our industry knowledge to be able to kind of say, yeah, that seems fair enough or not, so that's giving them some kind of benchmark on it. They've also had it costed based on as is now, and if the only change is the fabric, then we can ask for, okay, so what's your price per metre for the fabric, and we can kind of dig down a bit more into that detail. That's the only way that I've seen it done and not be challenged in terms of the way that it's done. I think you have to be upfront if that's something you're expecting to have to change.
Yeah, and I think there's got to be a really good reason for that change.
Yeah.
So I think, probably the biggest example that we could give now is that in hindsight, we weren't as informed about the contaminants issue. So if we could have had a technical refresh that would have brought in, say, a particular blocking fire hood, then that would have been, quite a good advancement in terms of safety for everyone. A real good, strong business case. But if you're just updating the supplier of the trim, or you're developed a new fabric which is slightly better in performance, there's no real business case for that. And we have to be really careful of those old enough to remember triggers broom. So we're replacing the element, it's still got life in it, through that technical refresh, and if we keep doing that, we'll never ever go back to market, because there's life in that new technical refresh product, etc. I'm going to say a huge thanks to the panellists here, and I thank you all for your attention and participation.
Thanks.
Thanks, Beth.
Thanks for listening. If you like this session, then be sure to browse the rest of the programme for the show. Share the link and subscribe to receive updates on new content from us here at Emergency Services Times.